This is a 5-part video series with Dale Phillips at Laney College demonstrating the Weld 215 project.
Here we are today at Laney College talking about soldering and brazing. And for our Weld 215 class, which is called Welding for ECT, which stands for Environmental Controls Technology. All right. Their main thing that they do in their trade is soldering and brazing. So periodically they need to do a little bit of welding to make a little stand or a little tray to catch water in, but typically most of what they do is soldering and brazing. Now I have two pieces here, and the first piece I have here is done with a low temperature solder, and we're doing it with a white metal, and white metals typically have a low melting temperature. At one time a lot of soldering was done with lead. Now we try to use solders with zero lead in them. Over the years I saw the amount of lead in solder go down, down, down. Now it's zero. This one here is 95.5, and the majority of it is zinc, and I think the 5% is tin. So with this solder here, it's lead-free. It has a little bit higher melting temperature than lead, but it's lead-free. All right. So with this solder here, we cannot join things together without flux. And so everybody gets a tub of flux, and I tell people that this is a lifetime supply of flux, right, for most people. So we got a big tub of it here, and we just need to put a thin coating of flux onto the metal, or else the solder won't stick when we go to solder. It's very important that we put this on, and it's very important that we don't burn it off when we heat up the pipe. If we burn it off, even though we put it on, the solder's not going to stick. All right? So we got to put it on. It's got to stay wet while we're soldering the whole time. But we don't need to put very much. We don't want the solder to be dripping, the flux to be dripping off of the pipe as we're heating it up. So we just put a thin film on, and when I put solder flux on it, I'll use a brush and this brush, we got to be real careful about not getting it too dirty. And after we're done using it for the day, we want to wipe it with a paper towel and put it back into the holder. And the one thing I would like to say is that fluxes are typically made out of acid, okay? And so the fumes that are produced when the flux burns is kind of acidic, and we want to try to avoid getting any of the fumes into our eyes, okay? So as I will flux the end of a pipe, I'll put a little bit of flux on, and I'll wipe it going in the off direction. So I'm basically wiping it off of the edge. And as I'm putting it on, I'm doing a lot of rubbing. And as I rub it, it helps to clean the pipe. Remember, this is acid, right? And so I'm cleaning the pipe chemically at the same time I'm putting the flux on. And just like when we wash our hands, right? If we use warm water, it cleans easier And if we use a rag or a brush, it's easier to clean our hands. So this is kind of like a scrub brush, and we're scrubbing at the same time we're putting the flux on. And when we heat the pipe up, or if the pipe is warm, it'll also clean up easier and quicker, all right, when we go to do it. Now, when we go to do our low temperature solder, it's not as strong, all right? And we have to have joints that overlap each other, all right? These are sleeve type fittings. We wouldn't be able to join pieces of pipe end to end like we do when we weld, because the solder just wouldn't be strong enough to hold the pipes together, all right? So we're not looking at the solder for strength, we're looking at it to seal the pipe up. And after we're done, right, we're going to test these by putting about 120 pounds of air pressure into the pipe and then submerging it underwater and seeing if there's any bubbles that come out. A lot of times when people solder, especially when they're first learning, they will think that they did a good job all the way around, but when we dunk it in the water, we see bubbles coming out of one of the joints, right? And this is what I call the acid test, right? We don't want this to leak. Now, if we don't do a perfect job soldering it up everywhere, as long as it doesn't leak, it'll probably be okay. We just want this to not leak for its whole life, all right? If it doesn't leak, then probably everybody's going to be happy, right? Now, sometimes we need to have lines that are under higher pressure, all right? And this type of solder isn't strong enough for high pressure pipes. So we'll use another type of solder that sometimes we call silver solder, right? And this solder is much stronger because it has copper as one of the metals that the filler rod is made out of. And when we join the pipes together with this rod, it actually is just as strong as the copper pipe that we're joining together. And we can see, if I pull one of these out, that this is hard. When I let go of it, it just comes straight again, right? Whereas the soft solder, I can uncoil it, I can solder with it, and then when I'm done soldering, I can wind it back up on this roll for use later on. All right? We can't do that with this rod. Now, this solder here probably has to be heated up to about at least 600, 650 degrees before it's going to start melting. Where this solder here, we're going to have to get it up over 1,000 degrees before it starts to melt. All right? So we can take a look at the two pipes that I put together. And this one here, we don't have a lot of discoloration, more so than necessary. But if we look at the other pipe, we can see that it got a lot hotter while it was being joined together. And it gets to a point where it's really hard to see the filler rod that we're adding. It kind of disappears in there, right? Everything gets so black and discolored. Now, the top piece of this square is from this square. So it was cut off from this one and reattached to this one. And the main reason we do that is to save money, because this is one of the more expensive fittings that we buy. And we need this threaded fitting in order to connect up our compressed air line. And so we'll screw this on to our pipe when we're done, and then we'll pressurize it, right, with air and stick it into a water trough to see if we get any bubbling. If we get any bubbling, we need to take it back and repair. Now, the higher temperature rod is much easier to repair because the higher temperature rod doesn't require any flux when we go to weld up. The lower temperature solder requires flux. And a lot of times when there's a hole, it's very difficult to repair because the flux has dried up inside the pipe where the leak is. And so sometimes these pipes here have to be pulled apart, cleaned up real well, right? And then put back together to fix it, which is very difficult to do. And so, especially when we're doing this type of soldering here, we want to get it right the very first time, right? Usually when I do this class on Saturday, once people are done with their project, they get to go home. And some people go home in half the time as other people, right? Because they've already soldered before in their life, they're a little bit familiar with it, they knock it out real quickly. The people that have never done it before sometimes have to make 2 of these because it gets screwed up so bad that it's easier to start all over again than it is to do more repair work, right? And so that's the big problem with this one. The big problem with this one is we got to get the pipe so hot when we're putting it together that the copper actually turns red hot. It starts turning orange. And when the copper pipe starts turning orange, it's not very far away from making a hole in the pipe because this is a thin wall copper pipe. A lot of times people will burn a hole right through the copper. And what we want to remember is that when we're working with an acetylene torch, that flame is really hot, it heats things up really fast, and so we got to keep that torch moving around. All right? If we move the torch around on the pipe, we won't make a hole. The holes happen when people stop moving around. And especially people that haven't welded before, they're not very good at using both of their hands at the same time. And so either they're adding solder with this hand and holding the torch in one spot, or they're not adding solder and moving the torch around on the pipe. They can't do both at the same time. Right? As we practice, we want to teach ourselves to be able to use both hands at the same time. While we're adding filler metal, keep moving the torch around on the pipe. This second project with the high temperature has another added feature to it. We added another T-joint to the bottom, and then took the pipe and just bent it. And after bending it, right, I left a little opening on the end, and this opening, all right, is the door that I stick the rod into. And this bottom area down here is sealed with solder. And so no air comes out of this fitting here. And a lot of times when they're doing air conditioning work, they'll be working with flexible coils of copper, and at the end of the coil, they will just bend it and seal it up without putting a cap on the end of the pipe. So this kind of serves like a cap in a way. I think we can stop there.